So here's where the story changes. Not slowly, not quietly, but in a way that forces you to look at Kiss differently. Because what happened next wasn't about guitars or stage lights or even the music anymore. It was about paperwork, contracts, ownership, and money, and how those things can outlast the band itself. Years after walking away from Kiss, Vinnie Vincent didn't just fade into the background. He came back with a legal case that had the potential to shake everything fans thought they understood about the band. And the date matters here, July 1997. That's when Vincent Cusano, the man the world knew as Vinnie Vincent, officially filed a lawsuit against Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, the Kiss Company, PolyGram, and several related entities. And when you look at the scope of what he was claiming, this wasn't a small dispute. It was a multi-layered legal attack that touched royalties, contracts, publishing rights, defamation, and even the use of his image. And depending on how the damages were calculated, this case could have crossed $15 million. So this wasn't just unfinished business. This was war. But to understand why that lawsuit happened, you have to go back to how things actually ended, because part 2 wasn't really an ending. It was a fracture. By the time the Lick It Up era wrapped in 1984, the relationship between Vinnie Vincent and Kiss wasn't just strained, it was unstable, undefined, and in a lot of ways already broken beneath the surface. He had helped the band during one of its most critical transitions, stepping in during a period where Kiss was trying to survive a changing music landscape, losing original members, and redefining their sound without makeup. And creatively, he contributed in a real way, co-writing multiple songs that became part of that comeback era. But the structure around him never matched that contribution, and that's where things started to turn. Because according to Vinnie Vincent's own later statements, the experience didn't feel like being part of a band. It felt like being hired, controlled, and replaceable. He would later say something that cuts right to the core of how he saw that time. My take-home pay was $550 a week. And when you hear that number, especially in the context of a band as big as Kiss, it doesn't sound like success. It sounds like limitation. It sounds like someone who didn't feel like an owner, but like an employee. And the tension didn't stop there. According to reporting tied to the lawsuit in 1997, Vincent claimed that when he refused to sign an employment agreement that would have locked him into a specific role inside the Kiss structure, his salary was cut, down to about $1,000 a week. Now, whether you take those numbers as exact or as part of his perspective, the feeling behind them is what matters. Because from his point of view, this wasn't just about money. It was about what that money represented: control, status, and ownership. And this is where the story gets more serious, because Vinnie Vincent wasn't just passing through Kiss. He was there officially from around April 1982 to April 1984. And during that time, he wasn't just playing guitar on stage, he was helping shape the music. According to court records, he co-wrote 3 songs on Creatures of the Night in 1982, and then went on to co-write 8 songs on Lick It Up in 1983. That's not a minor role, that's 11 songs tied directly to a period where Kiss was trying to rebuild itself. And years later, even after he was no longer part of the band, he came back into the creative process again, co-writing 3 songs for the 1992 album, Revenge. So from a purely factual standpoint, Vinnie Vincent wasn't just a touring musician. He had writing credits. He had creative fingerprints on multiple albums. And in the music industry, writing credits are everything, because that's where the real money lives. And that's exactly where the lawsuit begins. Because by the time we reach 1997, Vinnie Vincent wasn't arguing about his role anymore. He was arguing about what that role should have paid him over time. And the numbers start to shift here, Public reporting at the time said he was seeking at least $1.3 million in damages, but when you look deeper into the filings and the expanded claims, the number grows, with estimates around $5.5 to $5.8 million. And when you factor in the possibility of treble damages, which can multiply certain types of claims, the total exposure could have pushed beyond $15 million. And when you hear that kind of number, you realise this wasn't symbolic. This wasn't about making a statement. This was about recovering what he believed he had lost. But here's where it gets complicated, because the lawsuit itself wasn't built on just one argument. It was layered, and each layer tells you something different about how Vinnie Vincent saw his time with Kiss and how Kiss operated as a business. At the centre of it all were royalties. That's the foundation. The money generated by songs from Creatures of the Night, Lick It Up, and later Revenge. Money that continues to flow as long as those songs are played, sold, streamed, or licensed. Vincent claimed he did not receive the royalties he was entitled to from those works. And tied directly to that was an accounting dispute. The argument that Kiss and its related entities had not properly calculated or reported what he was owed. And then there was a more explosive claim, one that goes beyond numbers. He alleged that a photocopied version of his signature had been used on an agreement connected to his Revenge-era song rights, essentially suggesting that he had been cut out of ownership through a document he didn't properly authorize. Now that is an allegation, not something proven in court, but it shows you the level of distrust that had built up over time. Because at that point, this wasn't just about missing payments. It was about whether the system itself had been manipulated. And the lawsuit didn't stop there. It reached into how he was represented, how he was remembered, and how his identity was used. In 1994, Kiss released the Kiss Storybook, a large, high-profile retrospective documenting the band's history. Vincent claimed that his image had been used without proper authorization, raising what's known as a right of publicity claim. And on top of that, he alleged defamation, pointing to statements made about him in Kiss-related materials, including videos and published content. So when you step back and look at the full picture, this lawsuit wasn't just about unpaid royalties. It was about ownership of work, control of identity, and how history itself is written. But even before the case could fully unfold, something from Vinnie Vincent's past came back into the picture, and this is where things start to shift in a way most fans don't expect. Because in 1989, years before the lawsuit, Vincent had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. And inside that bankruptcy filing, he listed his Kiss-related song rights. But here's the detail that becomes critical later. The value of those rights was listed as unknown. And as part of the restructuring plan, the numbers tied to those assets were surprisingly small, about $40,000 overall, and specifically around $1,521.60 connected to retaining those rights. Now at the time, that might have seemed like a technical detail, but years later, inside the courtroom, it became something much bigger. Because the question became, if those rights were handled a certain way during bankruptcy, did he still have the legal standing to pursue claims connected to them? And that question didn't just weaken parts of the case, it reshaped them. As the lawsuit moved forward through the late 1990s, the scope of what Vinnie Vincent was trying to prove began to shrink. Not because he changed his claims, but because the legal system started narrowing what could actually be argued. Some claims were dismissed because too much time had passed. Others were limited by legal technicalities. And piece by piece, the case that started as a broad, multi-million-dollar challenge began to lose ground. But then, in 2001, something happened that gave the story a temporary shift. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals stepped in and reversed parts of the earlier rulings, allowing certain aspects of the case to move forward again. And for a moment, It looked like Vinnie Vincent might actually get the full hearing he had been pushing for. But that moment didn't mean victory. It meant delay. It meant another round. And it meant that the real test was still coming. And that test arrived in 2003. This is the turning point. This is where everything changes. Because in a federal district court ruling, the remaining core of Vinnie Vincent's case, especially the royalty-related claims tied to "lick it up," was examined directly, and the court's conclusions were not what he needed. The judge found that there was no sufficient evidence showing that Kiss had miscalculated or improperly accounted for royalties. And even more importantly, the court pointed to something that became decisive. Vinnie Vincent had a contractual right to audit the accounts, to request records, to verify the numbers, and he never exercised that right. And in legal terms, that matters. Because if you have the right to challenge the numbers and you don't use it, it becomes much harder to later claim that those numbers were wrong. And then there was another critical point. The court rejected the idea that Kiss had a fiduciary duty to act in Vinnie Vincent's financial interest. In other words, this wasn't a partnership in the legal sense. It was a business relationship defined strictly by contract. And once the court framed it that way, the emotional argument disappeared. What remained was paperwork. And when you reduce a case like this to paperwork, the outcome becomes much colder. Because now it's not about who contributed more. It's not about who deserved more. It's about what was signed, what was proven, and what could be enforced. And in that environment, Vinnie Vincent's case began to collapse. And by the time the appeals process played out through the mid-2000s, the direction was clear. The remaining challenges failed. And in October 2006, the United States Supreme Court declined to hear the case, effectively ending the legal fight at the highest level. That was the final door. There was nowhere left to go. But the story doesn't end there, because the aftermath might be the most ironic part of all. After the case was resolved, the court awarded attorneys' fees and costs to the Kiss side defendants. The numbers were specific: about $66,457 in attorneys' fees, and approximately $15,473 in additional costs. That brings the total to just over $81,900. And that alone would have been a difficult outcome. But it didn't stop there, because in 2012, another ruling allowed those debts to be collected in a way that directly connected back to the original issue. The court approved efforts to levy up to 100% of Vinnie Vincent's royalty income to satisfy that judgment. And when you step back and look at that, the lawsuit that was meant to recover royalties ended with royalties being taken from him. And this is where everything settles. Not into clarity, but into something far more unsettling. Not a victory, not a clean resolution, just a shift in how you see the whole story. Because this isn't only about what happened to Vinnie Vincent, it's about what Kiss had already become by that point. Not just a band, but a structure, a system, a machine built on contracts, ownership, and control, designed to keep moving forward no matter who stood inside it. And the question that lingers isn't comfortable. Was Vinnie Vincent a key creative force who never truly received what he earned? Or was he caught in a system he didn't fully understand until it was already too late to change it? Because the answer isn't handed to you. It's something you have to sit with. And the uncomfortable truth is, both of those things can exist at the same time. Because when you look closely at what happened, this wasn't a simple story of right and wrong. It was a collision between a musician who believed his creative contribution should translate into long-term value, and a business structure that was built to define value strictly through contracts. And once you understand that, the entire situation starts to feel less like a personal dispute, and more like a system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Because Kiss, by the early 1980s, was no longer operating like a traditional band. It had already evolved beyond that. What Gene Simmons and Stanley were building wasn't just a musical act. It was a controlled entity, a brand, a corporation. One where ownership, trademarks, publishing rights and legal agreements mattered just as much, if not more, than who was standing on stage. And that shift didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually, through experience, through conflict, through the departures of original members who had already tested the limits of what it meant to be part of KISS. By the time Vinnie Vincent entered the picture, that transformation was already in motion. And by the time he left, it was fully in place. So when Vinnie Vincent later said he felt like there was literally nothing in it for him, that statement doesn't just reflect frustration. It reflects a mismatch, a difference in expectation. Because from his perspective, writing songs, contributing creatively, being part of a major album cycle should have created a long-term financial connection. But from the business side, those contributions were already defined within agreements that controlled exactly how much he would receive and for how long. And once those agreements were set, the system didn't bend. It didn't adjust based on perception, it followed the paperwork. And that's where this story becomes difficult for fans. Because fans don't think in contracts, they think in moments, they think in songs, they think in performances, solos, albums, the things they can hear and feel. So when someone like Vinnie Vincent contributes to multiple songs across key albums, it feels natural to assume that he should share in the long-term success of those records. But the music industry doesn't operate on feeling. It operates on structure. And in that structure, everything depends on what was agreed to at the time, not what feels fair years later. And this is where the 2003 court ruling becomes more than just a legal decision. It becomes a statement. Because when the court said there was no evidence of improper accounting and emphasised that Vinnie Vincent had the right to audit those accounts but never used it, what they were really saying is this: the system gave you a mechanism to challenge it, and you didn't use it. And in legal terms, that's decisive. Because courts don't fill in gaps based on what might have happened. They look at what was documented, what was exercised, and what can be proven. And when those pieces don't align, the case collapses. But here's the part that lingers. Even after all the rulings, even after the appeals failed, even after the Supreme Court declined to hear the case in October 2006. The emotional side of the story doesn't disappear, because legal outcomes and personal truth are not always the same thing. And that's where Vinnie Vincent's voice still carries weight. When he stood in front of the media in 1997 and said that artists give their hearts and souls and get nothing back but heartache, he wasn't speaking in legal language, he was speaking from experience, from perception, from what it felt like to be inside that system and then outside of it. And whether or not the courts agreed with him, that feeling is real. But at the same time, there's another reality that can't be ignored. KISS survived, not just survived, but continued, through lineup changes, through legal battles, through shifting eras of music. And the reason they were able to do that is because the structure held, because ownership remained centralized, because the contracts defined control, because the system didn't rely on any one individual to function. And that's not an accident, that's design. And once you see that clearly, the story of Vinnie Vincent stops being isolated. It becomes part of a pattern where musicians come into KISS, contribute, and then exit, while the core structure remains intact. And that raises a bigger question, not just about Vinnie Vincent, but about KISS itself. Was this model unfair to the people who came through it? Or was it the only reason the band was able to last as long as it did? Because if you loosen that structure, if you turn every contributor into a long-term stakeholder, if you open up ownership across multiple members over time, you risk losing control of the very thing that keeps the brand alive. But if you tighten that structure, if you limit who owns what, if you define contributions strictly within contracts, you create situations like this, where someone walks away feeling like they gave more than they received. And that tension, that balance between control and contribution, that's the real story here. Not just what happened in court, but what it represents. Because this wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a rare moment where the internal mechanics of KISS were exposed to the outside world, where fans could see, even if just briefly, how the machine actually worked. And then there's the ending, because no matter how you interpret the case, no matter which side you lean toward, the final outcome is hard to ignore after everything was said and done, after years of legal battles, after appeals and rulings. The system didn't just reject Vinnie Vincent's claims, it turned the financial pressure back onto him. Over $81,000 in legal fees and costs, and eventually the ability to collect that money directly from his royalty income, which means that the very thing he went to court to recover became the thing used to settle the judgment against him. And when you sit with that, it changes the way you hear the story, because now it's not just about what he lost, it's about what it cost him to try and prove it. And maybe that's the part that stays with you. Not the filings, not the rulings, but the idea that once a band crosses a certain line, once it becomes more than music, the rules change, the expectations change, and sometimes the people inside it don't realize that until it's already too late. So now the question isn't just about Vinnie Vincent anymore, it's about legacy, about how history is written, about who gets remembered as essential and who gets remembered as replaceable. Because the records still exist, the songs are still played, the credits are still there, but the story behind them, that's where everything becomes complicated. And what comes next doesn't go backward, it moves forward. Into what happened after the lawsuit, into how Vinnie Vincent's life and career unfolded beyond this point, and into the deeper question that every fan eventually has to face. What really matters more? The music that was created, or the system that decided who it belonged to?